Okay. So this is a highlight of our class, of course, because if any educated people heard about Byzantium, probably the next thing that the word Byzantium would trigger be Justinian, right? And as already seen from communicating with you, Justinian, it's a big point. It's high, and somehow it's important. I noticed it's important for students. They have special relations to Justinian in a sense. He's a special person, something like that. And Emperor Anastasius didn't leave a hair, right? And as it was the case in the Roman Empire earlier, there was another soldier emperor, Justine, who was from Prague. He was, as it was expected from a soldier emperor, was barely literate. And as also is expected that the person who didn't have a chance to get education would make sure that his children would get a decent education. And that's the case of his nephew, who named himself after his uncle and became Justinian the First. He's never mentioned Justinian the First, despite the fact Justinian the Second reigned at the end of the 7th century and presided at the council in Trula in 691. But he's just mentioned Justinian. So whenever you say Justinian, I believe that all of you can picture this, can have this snapshot in front of your eyes. We'll see if it's here or not. From Ravenna, from imperial forepost in Italy, where Justinian is depicted. Justinian is depicted with his right, with his retinue. Okay. Okay. Mm-hmm.
We're in the Italian city of Ravenna, standing outside of the Church of San Vitale. This is a really important 6th century church. It's really old.
And it's unusual in that it's a centrally planned church. That means its focus is on its center instead of a basilica, which has a long or longitudinal axis.
Right. When we think about a church, we generally think about a building that's shaped like a cross, and it has that long hallway, the nave. This doesn't have that. Instead, it's got an ambulatory or aisle that surrounds a central space. In this particular case, on the east side of the church, there's also an extension with an apse at the end.
Looking at the outside of San Vitale, we see that it has 8 sides. So it's an octagon, and within that octagon is a smaller octagon that rises higher.
The exterior of the church is brick. Those bricks were taken from ancient Roman buildings and reused here in the 6th century. The walls are pierced with lots of windows, and that's especially important because the interior is covered with some of the most magnificent mosaics that survive from the early medieval period.
And of course, you'd want that light glistening on the gold and beautifully colored mosaics. Let's go inside and have a look.
We've walked into the church, and the center towers over us.
And yet, these apse-like shapes that are supported by columns undulates and moves around us.
There are massive piers that help support the building, but there's also real delicacy. Look, for instance, at the way that the columns are doubled, that is, stacking of one set of columns above the next.
And they moved in and out back into the space of the ambulatory on the ground floor and then up into the gallery above.
But the real gem in this church can be seen on the east end. Let's walk over there. The eastern end of San Vitale is completely covered in dense mosaic.
These tiny pieces of glass and glass sandwiching gold that reflect the light. Justinian, the emperor in Constantinople in the early 500s, sends his general Belisarius to conquer Italy, to reconquer Ravenna, and reestablish Orthodox Christian belief here in Ravenna.
And the Arian belief was suppressed. And so what we're seeing here is the reassertion of Eastern imperial control. That is, Justinian is in Constantinople, in the east, and he is saying, I'm in charge even here in Ravenna, in Italy.
Spiritual power go hand in hand with political power, with the power of the emperor.
We see Justinian in the center, wearing purple, the color that is associated with the throne, and he's surrounded by his court. But there are also religious figures representing the church, and there are soldiers. Three centers of power: the church, the emperor, and the military.
So we can see that some of the figures are treated more individualistically than others. Justinian, Maximian are more individualized, and it's possible that people at the time would have looked up and recognized the other figures who are lost to us today. But the figures from the army are much more anonymous.
Justinian, the emperor, authority is divine. You can see a halo around his head, and he holds a bowl associated with the Eucharist, which he's handing in the direction of Christ in the apse.
Right, this is a bowl that would have contained the bread for the sacrament of the Eucharist. He's in the center of the composition, he's frontal, but really all of the figures in this mosaic are frontal.
They are schematic, abstracted. This is the medieval. We've left the classical tradition of naturalism behind.
And so if we look closely at the figures, we can see that there's no real concern for accurate proportions. Their feet don't really seem to carry the weight of their bodies. They seem to float in an eternal space and not in an earthly space. Next to Justinian, we see the bishop, Maximian, with his name above him, although that was added later. And beside him, other clergymen.
Maximian holds a beautiful jeweled cross, and he wears the same purple that the emperor wears, associating him with the power of the emperor in Constantinople.
The figures next to him hold a jeweled Book of the Gospels, and the figure at the far right holds an incense burner. What we're seeing here is the emperor leading a procession for the enactment of the sacrament of the Eucharist.
And in fact, the Eucharist would have been performed in the sanctuary. The figures stand in front of a field of gold, which is very much a Byzantine tradition.
And when we say Byzantine, we're referring to the capital of the empire, which is Constantinople,
which we now call Istanbul. You'll notice that the tesserae, that is, these small pieces of colored glass, many of them with gold leaf that is actually fused almost like a sandwich in between two pieces of clear glass, are set into the wall at angles so that the light reflects off them in a way that is complicated and beautiful and creates a sense of the liveliness of the surface. And that would have been especially true when it was illuminated by candles and by lanterns. Let's walk around to the other side and take a look at the panel devoted to Theodora, Justinian's wife. To the right of the apse windows, we see the panel of Theodora, the empress, and it mirrors the panel with Justinian.
So we have an idea that Theodora, Justinian's empress, ruled as co-equal to Justinian, that she was a very powerful woman, even though she was reputedly of lower class, that she was an entertainer, apparently.
There are some colorful descriptions of her past. She's wearing incredibly elaborate clothing and jewelry with rubies, with emeralds, with sapphires, and very large pearls. And in back of her head, just like Justinian, is a halo which speaks not to her own divinity, but to the divine origin of her authority.
Like Justinian, who's carrying a bowl that held the bread for the Eucharist, Theodora is carrying the chalice for the wine for the Eucharist. And like Justinian too, she's surrounded by attendants that symbolize the imperial court. A curtain is raised as though she is about to take part in a ceremony related to the Eucharist.
I'm really taken by the elaborate Byzantine costume.
Well, there's a sense of trying to bring the richness of the imperial court in Constantinople here to Ravenna.
Okay. Right. So with Justinian, it's important to realize that when you look when you think about his reign, you divide it into two halves. One we didn't talk about one before Nikari War and the other after Nikari War. Because all what Justinian is known happened after Nikari War, right? And Nikari War is a very Roman thing. It's something that gives one a good, solid foundation to argue that Byzantium preserved very, very substantial Roman legacy. Right, we'll get there. We'll get there. So, connecting with what Dr. Karabenikov was saying yesterday, right? That when we deal with sources, to get our hands on the contemporary sources, that sources doesn't mean that we will get not distorted picture. I don't want to go to another extreme and starting to how to say, to debunk or be disrespectful to Procopius, but definitely Procopius requires very critical treatment, and also his own agenda has to be identified. And his own agenda was that Procopius belonged to old Roman family, precisely this kind of families that because of whom Emperor Constantine wanted to establish his own new capital. So, and for him, despite the fact that Justinian was adequately educated, he was still an upstart. And this approach he projected in his writings. So that's something that is interesting, that there was social mobility with Theodora and Justinian, and also in Nikari Revolt, where people were able to disobey emperor, even set up a riot like that. Yes, Yevgraf, what's
why is it that Procopius writes two different works, and in one of them he heavily praises Justinian in the buildings,
right?
And then in the secret history he just talks, like, just says like the worst things about him and his wife's friend.
Well, right? He was saying totally to understand it, right? Procopius was saying, wherefore to me and many other of us, those two seem not to be human beings, but veritable demons, and what the poets called vampires, who laid their heads together to see how they could most easily and quickly destroy the race and deeds of men, and assuming human bodies became men demons, and so convulsed the world. And one could find evidence of this in many things, but especially in the superhuman power with which they work their will. So, like, I mean, sort of they're like Hollywood movie. What would it be like? I don't know. When the half man of half what's this name for this combined sort of creature? That's anyway.
But why does he say good things about him then?
Because he wrote those were official writings.
Oh,
those were official writings, right? That's why it's called his secret history, because when he was writing in his capacity as an official historian, right? You see that he followed, like in wars, he would give a dialogue from a Persian general, sort of quoting whatever he believed the general was saying. So it's differently written, but this is collection of gossips, and again, we never would know anyone's intention. We never would read anybody's mind. It's very bad. how to say, try to attempt to get into anybody's mind. But we don't know why Procopius did it. Was it intentionally to leave sort of to slander them intentionally? Was it just collection of gossips? That's also, that makes it more plausible. He just collected various outrageous gossips there. But anyway, I don't want to spend more class time on this right now. Okay, so back to the beginning. And with Justinian, right, one of the things that is clear is that an emperor, a ruler, a leader is as good as his team. And Justinian, perhaps because he himself wasn't born as a purple, he didn't take it for granted. He realizes, right? He realizes, and to see his team, we will look at the tables that I made for you here, right? So there are several directions of his reforms, right? And they had very capable people, like Belisarius, of course, as a military commander is most notorious. But we also see that there was Tribonian, who supervised this legal reform, and that legal reform was finished in very short time, something like 2 years, and it's included only laws without commentaries. Okay, so Justinian, you kind of see why people were sort of why people experience this mixture of love, hate, sort of admiration and hate, because he was really very, how to say, quite a superhuman in what he has done to the empire, like, you know, capturing territories, leaving Hagia Sophia after him, right? Reforming law, and also the fact that they were of humble origin, I think, contributed. And I just saw another day that we have Saint Mary of Egypt, right, who was who lived maybe 100 years later than, or like 70 years later than Theodora, and both of them were from Alexandria. I'm not sure what is precise source of the information that Empress Theodora, she was a prostitute. Procopius wrote about her ectu pornou, so ectu pornou, that she was, and pornou, it's stem of pornography, or like everything uncleanness, and so on, fornication, all kind of stuff. But I never looked into this. But be this as it may, we know that Saint Mary of Egypt, she was a harlot, but she became a universal saint, a huge saint of. And Theodora, she kind of followed in this path, and I have a soft spot for her just for one fact, that she adopted special law that would prosecute gigolos, that would prosecute people who would solicit for girls, and often deceiving parents, deceivingly sort of, okay, we will look after your girls, and no harm would be done, and basically.
Ocha, do you mean pimp? Because gigolo is male prostitute.
Oh, I didn't know. I meant pimp. Yes, thanks for correcting. Yep, that's it. So yeah, and that's something that she did. They also had they had special attention for moral laws in the empire. I mean, there were laws against homosexuals and so on. So they kind of had had it on their mind, right? Okay. They had strong chemistry between themselves. They supported each other. They kind of, it's really, I think, hard to say that Fyodora dominated. I think they were equals, right? And we yesterday looked at that beautiful speech that was conducted by Fyodora, right? And maybe next time we will look how it happened based on a video recording of that speech through the Russian 1980s movie, right? And sort of. So this is a speech again that Dr. Karabenikov yesterday shared with us. So and also Fyodora passed away earlier than Justinian, right? She passed away earlier, and I think it actually makes it natural stop for today's class, and we will continue, God willing, next week. So anybody else questions? If Graf asked a couple of them. Anybody else has questions for me?
I have more.
Good for you. Good for you. Good for you. If no one, yes, Elijah, speak up, please.
In